Good afternoon. Today is December 4th, 2023. My name is Carlo Bird, and I'm interviewing Russell Contreras for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Please know, Mr. Contreras, that this recorded interview will be placed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection at the UT Austin. If there's anything you do not wish to answer or talk about, I will honor your wishes. Also, if there's something you do want to talk about, please bring it up and we'll talk about it. Because we are not conducting this interview in person, I need to record you consenting. So I'll ask you a series of 5 questions. Please say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one. There are 2 questions we need to make sure you agree to before we go on. Voces wishes to archive your interview, along with any photographs and any other documentation at the Benson Library at UT. We will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials you donate to Voces. Okay, so here's the first question. Do you give Voces consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library?
Yes.
Awesome. Second question. Do you grant Voces copyright over the interview and any material you provide?
Yes, although if the material is with the Associated Press, they have the copyright.
Yeah, okay, perfect. And do you agree to allow us to post this interview on the internet where it may be viewed by people around the world?
Yes.
Awesome. We have many questions in a pre-interview form that we already filled out. We use that information from the pre-interview form to help in research. The entire form is kept in a secure Voices server. Before we send it to the Benson, we would have it stripped out any contact info of yourself or your family members, so that will not be part of your public file. Your public file will only be accessible at the Benson Library. Do you wish for us to share the rest of your interview and your public file available to researchers at the Benson?
Yes.
And last question, on occasion, Voices receives requests from journalists who wish to contact our interview subjects. We only deal with legitimate news outlets. Do you give consent for us to share your phone numbers or your email with journalists?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. And so we can finally get into the questions. Thank you for your patience through all that. And so could you tell me a little bit about what you do?
I'm currently in the race and justice reporter, or the senior race and justice reporter for Axios, where I cover race and justice nationally, where how it intersects with the administration, but also how it intersects in the lower 48 and Hawaii and Alaska, and occasionally Latin America as the co-author of the Axios Latino newsletter.
Awesome. And how long have you been doing this work?
I've been in journalism for more than 25 years, started in the late 90s. I've been at Axios since 2020, at the end of 2020 after the election, but I've been a journalist for most of my life.
Awesome. And what made you want to pursue journalism?
I worked as a columnist when I was an undergrad at the University of Houston, and I was always interested in storytelling. I think I really didn't understand what a journalist was, even as an undergrad, because I didn't take journalism classes. I was a history and English major, and I focused on literature and writing. And it wasn't until I started grad school at the University of Houston, pursuing a PhD in history, where I then made the switch to go to journalism full time, and then later getting a job in Conroe and the Houston Press, then Alternative News Weekly, and then that's just launched my career.
Awesome. And so you've been in the game for a while, and you also covered the pandemic, and that's why we're here today. And so, um, how did that unfold? How did you recognize the seriousness of the pandemic
Well, it
as
was
a
in March. Yeah, it was in March of 2020 when we started seeing stories about the pandemic, and I remember getting notes that they were sending us home, and I was getting a lot of getting anxious. And I remember leaving the Associated Press. I just wanted to come home, and I thought at the time we may have be home for 2 weeks, maybe a few weeks, not knowing what was in store. So up at that point, we were just following reports of cases of COVID, if there had been any in the university, in the New Mexico area and neighboring states. Those are things, and then the numbers just started tripling, quadrupling, and then exploding. And so by that time, I left the Associated Press its office, and we started working remote from my home in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, another home that I was living in at the time. And then my daughters were told to stay home with school, and as well my wife had received the Teacher of the Year award from the state of New Mexico and was on a sabbatical to go around the state and talk about education in New Mexico. And she was at home, so she was no longer doing that. And her role transitioned to as well in trying to help teachers through the pandemic.
Cool. And so, well, not very cool, but it brought everyone home, there in your household. And how did the pandemic affect the way you worked as a journalist?
Well, luckily I did have an office, so I focused there. I was writing, and I was facing the window to the door of the street. I lived in a suburb of Albuquerque, New Mexico, but I was working. Everything was remote. We were on Zoom calls, following news, just doing it normal jobs, picking up stories from newspapers. But the pandemic was dominating everything. Everything was just pandemic related. There were no sports. The politics, everything centered around the pandemic. I cover race and justice, so I was trying to, with the Associated Press, I was on the race team, trying to find race angles on there. Being in New Mexico, I noticed right away that we were one of the epicenters of it. Being the Navajo Nation is right there at the edge of Western New Mexico, and so we started following the numbers there and seeing how the pandemic was disproportionately affecting Native communities. We have a number of tribes here, more than 24 or so, around 24, and all these tribes were being hit. The pueblos started closing down access. You could still get through the Navajo Nation because it's so vast, but that's where the big story was. And I noticed that nationally, the coverage was how it was affecting people of color, and they would focus on African Americans and Black Americans, as well as should. But what was getting overlooked was how it was affecting Latinos and Native Americans. As we started writing about this, I noticed right away, right online, that people wanted to debate, that Latinos on a race and so forth. And I did not enjoy and not engage in those debates because that was not, social media at the time was becoming more toxic. Seemed debate, it seemed nothing could be settled there. There was nothing to be litigated. All you could do as a reporter just report the facts and say how this is affecting, especially people dealing with poverty.
Yeah, and that's an important point you bring up, that people are becoming more polarized, yet you are still supposed to be objective and focus on the facts. How did that feel?
Well, I noticed this was a beginning of the time where social media was toxic, and we can talk about how it became the epicenter of my career at the Associated Press later on. I was trying to engage as much as I could, but I was beginning to pull back because I noticed that at the time, the main source for social media was Twitter. I was not engaging in Snapchat or I don't even TikTok or anything in those spaces. Instagram, not as much. So it would mainly just use it as where I was sharing my stories, engaging and saying this is what's happening. And I had started to really tone down my presence there, where I had been active. I'd been a former president of Unity, the Journalists for Diversity, and had been the financial officer for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. So I've been very engaged in there in media diversity. I was still engaged somewhat on that, being critical of the way we were covering Latino communities, making sure things like the shooting in El Paso, that there were folks, Latinos on panels on the Sunday talk shows talking about issues affecting Latinos, and usually they weren't. And I would call them out, often getting reprimanded by my boss, but I felt very strongly about this. This is what I felt. So at this time, I noticed that media companies were starting to clamp down on reporters, especially right into the pandemic. We hit the Black Lives Matter movement where George Floyd was killed. And then that created a whole new area for reporters and new landfills. And then I soon found myself covering the Black Lives Matter movement in Wisconsin.
That's great that you bring that up, because you shared a lot of your Twitter coverage of Kenosha protests. Please speak about that.
Well, right before Kenosha, when we were in the pandemic, I did cover a town, a mayor in Grants, New Mexico, who wanted to break all the pandemic-related restrictions. So that was my first move outside of my home to go on the field again. And this was a mayor between Albuquerque and Gallup, New Mexico, near the Navajo Nation. And he wanted to just lift the restrictions. He told businesses to open, golf courses to open. And this was like at the height. And it became a standoff between the state government and the local government, where the state police came in and shut things down. So it was the beginning of people defying orders or health orders around COVID. So that was my first. So up until that moment, I had not left. Then Jacob Blake was shot in Kenosha, Wisconsin. It was a disturbance at a home. Police came out. He ran from cops, and then they shot him as he was putting pull in the car. The shooting went viral. It was right at the height of George Floyd, so it became another case during the Black Lives Matter movement that people rallied around. Kenosha then erupted in violence, where buildings were destroyed. There was fires, and then I was dispatched to go to Kenosha to cover what was going on in this really suburb of Chicago and Milwaukee. So it was right there, and tensions were high, and I was sent to go to the scene.
I see. And I have a lot of questions in mind. But with that, what, or first off, how did you feel you were supported by your newsroom as you covered these things through the pandemic?
Well, it's difficult to see because at the time, being dispatched, there had been some adversarial relationships between me and my bosses because I'd been outspoken about media diversity. So sending me, I was part of the race and ethnicity team. I had that support, people in that team, very supportive. Those who were, say, above me were very skeptical of me because I've been speaking out. And I thought, in some cases, had responded accordingly. May have been backlash. But on the race and ethnicity team, I had support there where they sent me, they gave me the resources, I could do whatever I needed within reason. And going to a community that was on curfew, but also under health restrictions, made it very challenging. I got a place, a hotel. I would go late at night reporting, interviewing people. It was very difficult because, yeah, I rented a car and so forth. But if you did not plan and get food late at night, today we take it for granted. If you didn't eat and it's 9 o'clock, you can go get fast food or go to store. Those were not options. So then you were hungry for the night. Even so, journalists couldn't get access to alcohol. It was even the worst. So reporters, by 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, they were no longer serving alcohol in Wisconsin. Some actually drove to nearby Illinois to get alcohol at a gas station and a sandwich, as they were covering this cases that were trying to file stories and so forth. But it was challenging because there was a curfew, and then in the midst of that, I was pulled over. Me and another colleague were pulled over. It was a felony stop where I was trying to show the area where there had been a used car lot set up in flames. And as we were sending up there, we turned around because there was a blockage, and they were surrounded by cops with weapons drawn. In that part, I was my colleagues. It was in her rent a car. I lost my keys somewhere in that rent a car, and so I ended up losing keys to my rent a car. I had to be out there till 2 a.m. waiting for a tow truck that never came. It's very scary because, one, it was the pandemic. Two, it's a curfew. The places there's national, or not, I don't know if they're National Guard, but there were police presence all over the place from other departments. I let them know what I was doing. My car was stalled. I lost the keys, ended up having getting towed, and I had to get a new car or getting to the airport. So that was another added layer of the tensions of covering a racial justice story in the middle of a pandemic with the presence of police around, where me as a journalist of color and a man of color, that could do potentially a target. So I was trying to negotiate all that. Oh, by the way, also checking home to make sure that I was okay. Also wearing a mask, taking the precautions I needed.
Yeah, so that's like all the intersections in
Yeah,
one. And
yeah.
wow. Were the police there to check on you all, like to see what you all were up to?
No, they very seldom checked on. In many cases, they saw the reporters and the news media as adversarial. As once they pulled me over, and I explained who I was, and I showed them the deal, they're like, okay, this is who you are. We're just worried about outside people coming in. We're getting news reports that outside people are coming in to set more fires. There had been a number of burnt buildings around us. In addition, Donald Trump was coming into town. He was president at the time, and that was creating another set of a round of attention. I think Joe Biden was a presidential candidate. He was supposed to come in. I wasn't there for their later coming into Kenosha, but the tensions were very high and it had already blown up. So everybody was on edge. I was looking around, trying to also do my job as stories. And what I saw later on was the Kenosha community coming together, trying to rally around peace. They were putting up wood protections for businesses to make sure they weren't shattered, painting signs and murals saying Kenosha love and so forth. You started seeing signs that say Black trans lives matter too. So there was something else going on while this deal about Black Lives Matter was going on. There was also a bubbling trans movement that was going on. So as a reporter, you're looking for all this, but also negotiating all this stuff that's on your back. I'm not only taking notes, taking photos, recording video, trying to update my social media feed, but also give my various verticals at the Associated Press the needed, whether they needed photos, whether they needed video, all for that, because at this time you're basically a multimedia journalist being packed. So at the end of each night, I was absolutely tired.
Yeah. And you saying this is very important because I think the main reason we're having these conversations for the Voces Oral History Center is to show that it's not just the articles and photos happening. There's the labor and the laborers behind them. And that's the work you were doing. And with that, who was in Kenosha? What was the demographic like? Was it only Black people protesting for Black issues, or was it also like Latinos and other races?
Surprisingly, I did find some Latinos. I found a man from Guatemala. He was wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt, and he was there with his daughters at one of the protests. I found an old school Chicano who was there, who had, I believed he'd been from San Antonio, may have been a veteran. I took photos of him, talked to him, and I quoted him in one of the stories. So you did see Latinos there. It was mainly a working class town with ethnic whites, Irish, Italian, and also African Americans. It was in the middle of a place that was once indigenous land, as most of it was, but it had been lost over time. And people kept describing it as weird because it was surrounded by very rural Wisconsin towns that were largely white. And here was this one town that was people of color, that was poor, was working class. It reminded me of parts of working class Houston or working class Los Angeles or working class, less of Chicago, but more of those because it had the suburban feel, it was spread out. But you could see immediately there was a lot of pain. I went to the spot that he was shot. One thing that struck me is there was a older Black man who had come down and driven a few hours from Green Bay, and he brought his son, and he pointed and says, "This is where he was shot." And he started telling him, kind of educating him. But then he says, "Oh, but this is where I grew up. This is where I grew up. This is where I did. This is what happened. This is where I had a fight when I was a kid." This was somebody who was from the area, and he was from the area where Jason Blake had been shot. So this spot of pain became a spot of almost like spiritual reclaiming. You started seeing Black people come to the spot and lay down roses or send notes. They weren't sure where it was, but they could kind of tell by the video that it must have happened here. There was a car there. None of the people around there would talk. And I think because of the incident that happened, maybe police had scared them, or maybe they were involved in lawsuits. It was unclear. But people that were there would not talk to reporters, even reporters of color. They were just skeptical. And that showed me that there had been distrust of media for a long time, that we were now descending on the spot at a time of pain, and we hadn't been there at a time of joy. So we had never covered this spot. And I say we as media, I had never been to Kenosha, so I could never have done anything preventative. But the reporters there it had become a news desert in this era. Maybe the local paper had covered them, but national media had no interest in covering the city or that community. So to parachute in, you're going to get people who are skeptical, and you're going to get people who are adversarial. And that's what I encountered right away. And I recognized it.
Yeah. And do you think that distrust was new? Was it relevant to the time, or is it something that just had been stewing over time, already like present?
I think it'd been stewing over time. I wasn't sure because this is my first time there, but it was something that I recognized in communities across the country, even local here. If you never go to the Albuquerque South Valley, I say parts of McAllen, the Rio Grande, and you only go when there's a tragedy, or when there's a surge of migrants. Then all of a sudden you're asking about this, but you were never there when, say, the city hit a benchmark, are that you became a spot for Hispanic businesses. You were just coming in there at a time when there was pain. They're going to be skeptical because they don't trust you. And this happens a lot when I've gone to school shootings, where it's been, say, Roswell, New Mexico, or say Aztec, New Mexico, when I've covered mass shootings, that when you descend on the area, they'll know if you're local, but they'll also know if you know nothing about those communities and you're asking about this one particular instance and you make assumptions, they're going to be adversarial to you and not be cooperative. And they have no interest in wanting to share their stories.
And how do you navigate that when they are not trusting you and not wanting to talk to you?
You have to do the work. So on the way to Kenosha, as I was on the plane, I had printed out everything I could about the history of this city. What were the demographics? How was it founded? Who were the mayors? Who were the elected officials? Who were the Black leaders in this town? Were there any Latinos? Were there any cases of civil rights history there? Did Martin Luther King ever visit it? So I went there, and as I bounced around near the location where Jason Blake had gotten shot, I wasn't getting any feet. So then I moved a few blocks, and then I started getting people talking as I showed myself, and they would say, "Hey, Latino brother, what's up?" And I did get folks talking and saying, "Hey, man, the police have been harassing me all the time. Every time I go outside, they'll ask me what I'm doing here, and I'm saying I'm just, I'm mowing my lawn or I'm picking weeds. Well, you don't look like you belong here." And they would tell me stories. So then you started getting a picture about what the tensions there going around. Then I talked to a Black man who was an activist who was critical of cops, but he wanted to become a police officer. So it wasn't necessarily he was anti-police. He was saying, they don't let us in, and I want to be in. And so you started getting a full story and getting the sense. And then so I started talking to, say, the ethnic whites who were poor. And they would say, yeah, police harass me, but I think sometimes they may pour a glass of gasoline on it. And they, I mean, I'm assuming we're communities of color. So I started getting a full picture of and I started seeing that there were separate Kenoshas around that haven't been talking. And that to me seemed to be evidence of a lack of political leadership, of gathering folks. And so it was at a time of the Black Lives Matter movement where all these tensions and wounds were now finally being exposed to the general public. And Kenosha was just one story.
Yeah, and we don't have to get into it, but it reminds me of this documentary called The Two Towns of Jasper.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly like that. Okay, so you know what I'm
Right.
talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
And with that, and so you're uncovering these big issues with your own lenses, and you're also balancing the pandemic on top of that. How are you approaching people when we were so isolated at the time? We weren't encouraged to physically be with one another.
Well, one thing that I did when I was interacting still with Zoom, but on the field, what I would do is I would bring a lot of masks, and I had gotten to the point where I had ordered different masks that would reflect my personality. Some of them with the flag of New Mexico, some with the Aztec calendar on it. Others would say Marvin Gaye or Miles Davis. Those were always conversation starters. So they would see me, and I think I wore my Marvin Gaye one. I think Kenosha, because it was perfectly, I think it was, the setting was correct. They would start conversations, and that would be icebreakers. So we still had masks on, and then we were talking. And then that helped me when I was interviewing some young folks in Kenosha. They were like, it was funny because there was these young Black students, and I want to say maybe high school age or younger. And they said, "Why are you wearing a Black man on your face?" And it was Marvin Gaye. They had no idea who he was. And so I said, "Well, he's familiar with these songs." So I started naming songs. They had no idea. And then I sang a couple. "Oh, yeah, I know that song. That song was sampled by so-and-so." And so those became icebreakers. And so those are things that develop over time with COVID that fostered new sets of social interaction that weren't there before, but they were needed as we were being isolated and distrustful of each other and worried that we're going to catch something from each other. That those were things that we're able to break the ice and start conversations that we hadn't had before.
Yeah, and because you've been a reporter since before, during, and after. So, given that you've been adapting, like, what's the biggest change you've seen amongst those transitions?
Well, we
Like,
started working from home, and that was the best. We didn't need to be in a big newsroom, so that setting was blowing up. The Associated Press in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with the bureau that I had worked from, I moved from Boston and to come to AP. 12 years prior, that we had down to 2 of us in the newsroom. So every day we would commute both from Rio Rancho to 45 minutes to the offices at the Albuquerque Journal, where the Associated Press Bureau was located. And we didn't need to be there. We could have worked from home even before the pandemic, because very rarely did people come to meet us in the office. They did occasionally, but very rarely. Probably I can find a handful of times each year. We were there mainly for maybe some technical service for newspapers, to man the phone calls, but then again, we could have got those phone calls forwarded to our cell phones. So it didn't show that we needed to be there, but in the legacy media companies, especially among veteran journalists, everybody felt we needed to be there for some sort of cohesion. But even we were reported out of the Phoenix Bureau, where there was more staff, and then that staff edited all the bureaus from the state and the West region. They all came to Phoenix, so they all, when it may have been interacted, but for reporters, we didn't need to be there. So it put a damper in saying, why are we spending all this money and overhead for these offices that we don't need to go to, that are a waste, because you're spending electricity, you're spending money to whatever entity you're paying for these big rooms with only 2 people. And this was a bureau that was once 13 people strong and had been gone down to 2. Because of the reduction of newspapers, they've gotten smaller and smaller. And I noticed that the Associated Press, one of my jobs was to go through each newspaper and pick up the top stories of each one across the state, put it on the wire so that everybody could share it. It was being harder and harder because there were less reporters in those areas. And with COVID, it even knocked them out even more. So some newspapers I noticed were becoming ghost papers. There were papers that existed in towns that had no local reporters. They were actually sharing from each other already. So the AP, our job was already done. We became less relevant in those spaces, so we had to produce new stories. But it was very difficult when you can't even leave the space of your home. So if you can't leave the space of your home, why even go to the office? So even after COVID, I know that the reporters there were still at the AP said, why are we still in this model? This model's old. Why are we even doing the newspaper model? Less than 20% of our revenue comes from newspapers. We should blow it up and fundamentally change things, because this business model no longer works.
Yeah. And thank you for breaking that down for me. And with that, I'm sure there was probably personal beliefs and ideology on how serious the pandemic was and vaccines and whatnot. Was that ever like a talking point in the newsroom, navigating that safety and those?
Among some, I mean, some, we would say that you're required to be vaccinated and so forth. And I got vaccinated. I think I was the first one in my family to get vaccinated. I was on a list of kind of essential quasi, so I got vaccinated, and my wife did, and then my children. When I came back from Kenosha, I quarantined my place, and I stayed in my office for 2 weeks, not coming out. I'm putting pressure on the family because my wife had to do everything with our daughters, doing cooking dinner and so forth. And I would come at night and in with a mask on and do the dishes. That was our deal. So that put pressure on us. What was difficult is seeing the reaction on social media. Facebook was still a large presence, where people were interacting. This is the 2020 election was coming up, and people were still spreading false information, sharing stuff. I did have a brother-in-law who was sharing misinformation online. He and I were really cool, but he did not want to get vaccinated because he was believing what was being told, that he could have a heart problem. He had other health problems too as well, but he ended up getting COVID and dying that Christmas because of that. It made me angry because he later agreed. We finally convinced him to get the vaccination, but he got it too late, and then when he caught it at a Thanksgiving dinner, which we did not attend, we did not want to get exposed each other for that, and he got COVID, and he passed away by Christmas. So it made me angry that all this information was it could be very disseminated against people who had a lot of fears, a lot of questions. And us being so isolated, it was easy to do. And so bad actors were able to do that. And so he was one. I had other people, other family who got it. I knew other folks who got COVID and died. So it affected us as a Mexican-American family too as well.
And that's really unfortunate. I think misinformation does have really huge implications like that. And how do you balance your personal beliefs as like when you're reporting or even engaging with your family? Because that's a touchy thing for people. Some might just say, oh, like your brother-in-law, that because of their health, they're not participating. So,
No, it's difficult because I don't want to become the know-it-all either. I don't want to go on social media. So occasionally I say, hey, this is not fact, this is here. And that never worked, because what happened is you did that. My sister did this a few times with other relatives. You got attacked from all their followers. And then it served no purpose. But what I would do is try to do one-on-one conversations. Hey man, get vaxxed, bro. It's not a big deal. That guy's a loser. Don't listen to him. Right. What was most discouraging is these people who knew what I did as a living. They had shared stories I did, and even in cases would brag that I was in the media. Oh, he's a fair guy. Of course, they would say the stereotypical things they would see here from their talk radio. Oh, he's probably a left-wing socialist and so forth. And they would post things basically calling for the death of journalists, repeating some of the things that Donald Trump supporters had said. That journalism they were the enemies of the people, and they were enemies to the country and so forth, and had posting things, but basically calling for my death. And not me personally, but people like in my field. And so that was difficult. I'd wanted to respond a few times, like, hey man, do you want me to die? And I never did. I never engaged. And this is when I stopped engaging on Facebook, especially in this time, because I served no purpose. That Facebook was more of a place where you go to fight, and engagement was measured by how we interacted with each other in an adversarial way to start fights, to beef up engagement. And I think that's when Facebook tried to change its algorithms. And unfortunately, in doing that, they also took away how news is engaged, and news traffic went way down. So in the efforts to take away this combative environment, they took away the news. And now it's very difficult to get any kind of news on Facebook or getting our stories promoted through Facebook.
and does that still stand to today?
Yes, it stands today. Our traffic on Facebook is minimal. It's small. I think we may have gotten 40% of our traffic on Facebook, and now it's like 4. And so it's a small percentage. So as now at Axios, my work, it's mainly an online mobile. That's where our presence are. We have to try to get engagements elsewhere. So social media, Twitter, as it was never a spot, even though it engaged, and especially now that it is downfall, and some of the Elon Musk's behavior that people have, and that way advertisers have turned away. I've turned away from there and posting, because now I notice they've taken away my blue check. I'm not there. And now whenever I post something, I get engagement from people from far right, somewhat neo-Nazi flavor stuff. It's just an interaction. It's not worth it. So I very seldom engage there. And I'll probably be knocking and killing my account soon when I don't no longer need it.
And what does that mean for you as a journalist?
Well, you have to well, one, I spend less time on social media, and I spend more time reading books, which I should have done so in the begin with. But I've gone to Threads, I've gone to Blue Sky to post stories where there's few people can still engage with me. It's not nearly the same traffic, but it's better traffic than it is now on Twitter, because of the algorithms, where I'm not a paid subscriber. I'm not going to pay for that product. And the people that interact there are not people that will help me in my reporting. It's hard because it used to be going to Twitter, I could find sources and I could find people if there was like an incident in a particular town, a killing or a murder or a crime. I could go there, and people who were witnesses, and I can engage and get stories there. It's very difficult to do that now. You have to either go to the scene or find other methods to find people, witnesses to what happened to a story.
And one thing I've been wanting to consider also is the government response to the pandemic. Sorry that we're jumping, but
Sure.
how did the government response to the pandemic affect your work?
Well, in New Mexico, we had a Democratic governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, whose background was in health. So she was stronger in health and the health orders than others. And we had a largely Democratic state. Well, we did have a Democratic controlled Senate and House. So it lended to places where they were much more stringent on our health orders, more so than, say, neighboring Colorado, who also had a Democratic governor who was not as stringent later in the later months of the pandemic, and started opening up closer. In many ways, made fun of our governor for doing it. But our governor was since she was a healthcare person, was erred on the side of caution on that. before we started opening up. And it affected the state because we're one of the poorest states in the country, if not the poorest. We're always battling Mississippi in poverty. So as a result, it affected us long term. And it affected the school systems. And I saw this immediately with my daughters, where my oldest daughter was very social, and after pandemic, she was less. And I saw, in general, a lot of students behind in academically. We were a little bit at more advantage, as you could see. We read books. We're both middle class Hispanics with graduate degrees. We will all do what we can to make sure that our daughters are engaged, but that's not necessarily the case with other families who don't have the resources or the capital to do that, or the means to do so. So in New Mexico, that really affected it overall, and you cannot help be affected too as well, because you're surrounded by this. There were an occasion where Michelle Lujan Grisham did called out because there were stories that she, during the pandemic, while she was shutting down businesses and couldn't operate, went out and bought jewelry. And so that was a big backlash. The same thing that happened with Gavin Newsom, that it was like, and do as I say, not as I do. And there was a backlash on that. And that helped Republicans with ammunition, saying, look, you're asking us to make sacrifices that you yourself are circumventing. And so that was something that politically damaged her, and I think will be a black mark on her throughout her tenure here as governor.
And thank you for sharing that. Thinking about those work styles we developed during the pandemic, is there any that you kept after the fact?
Well, I started working from home, and my hours changed where I did not necessarily work a traditional 9 to 5. I would get up early, may do some other errands with my children during the day, and then they would go off and do something, and then come back at work. And I was actually working longer, but I felt I was working smarter. So, say like I was traditionally at the Associated Press, I'd be there 11. There was nothing for me to do. I would be looking for stories and all that, and I had a break from 11 to 1, and it would pick up again. Now, when I knew I had a break and there was nothing going on, people were returning the call, there were lunch and everything, I would take a longer break. But instead of just shutting it down at 5:30, I would keep going. And it especially helped if they were at home and they were playing around and I wasn't engaging. I'd wait for them to go to sleep, and at night I would have time to write. So that helped where I'm at night. It seemed at first a little scary saying I'm actually working longer, but I'm actually working smarter. So I'm not wasting time where I'm sitting at the computer trying to get a story done and they keep coming in my office. Whether I could say, okay, let me just step aside and not work. But from 7 to 9, I'm on. Or 9 to 11, I'm on. No one's going to stop me. The stories became stronger. And it was during this time that I noticed something while we were looking for stories. I was able, in my last months of the Associated Press, I was able to do stories that I'd always want to do, because everybody was so pandemicked out. They started looking for non-pandemic stories, and I started sneaking those in. Stories that I tried to do that I literally had to wait for an editor to either retire or die to finally get in. And one story I can point to was a piece that I'd want to do for years on the Underground Railroad to Mexico. During Hurricane Harvey, years before the pandemic, I had stumbled upon a story when I was in a historic black area of Houston called Freemanstown, area developed by emancipated enslaved people, that one house was destroyed. And one of the people I interviewed said it was unfortunate because when they tore it down, blah, 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 they found out it had a connection to the Underground Railroad to Mexico. And I mentioned this on a call, and my black editor at the time for our race and ethnicity team was fascinated, and so was one of our race and ethnicities national writers. And he was like, I've never heard of this. You got to be lying. And so I tried to pitch the story, and yeah, it's not right, or hey, you got other things to do. Until finally, at the right moment, I did this story, and this was one of the last big stories I did at the AP. It garnered a lot of attention while I was being interviewed. And that's what got the attention of Axios later on. Because after what has happened in the pandemic and because of the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of media outlets were facing pressure by their journalists of color to hire more Black and brown reporters to cover these issues. And Axios, still being a startup, it was founded in 2017, didn't have this yet. And so they said, yes, we agree, let's go find it. Who is this dude here, Russ? We should go ask him to apply for this position. And then they reached out to me, and that's what started our conversations.
And how did you feel as a Latino covering this intersectional story?
Well, I felt good, but I also knew that, knowing that when we cover race, it has been a large black-white dichotomy for years and continues to. But what was happening in the country is that now Latinos were the largest cohort, largest non-white group, whatever you want to call us, minority group, whatever the case is. I don't have a problem with that term, because it tells, the term minority talks about positions of power. So yes, we were the largest there. And even in my interview with Axios, I said, look, we got to stop talking in this linguistics of black-white dichotomy, because we're going to wake up and find out that the rest of the country is speaking a totally different language. Literally. One day, Latinos will become the majority. And if you're still talking in a black-white dichotomy, you won't be talking to the majority of the country. So it's important to do so. However, if I was going to enter in this space full time, I had to know some basic things about Black America. And that is, what is the legacy of slavery? What is the legacy of Jim Crow? What is the legacy of discrimination after the civil rights movements? And what's going on now? And you have to inundate yourself with that. It made no sense for me to go in while they're talking this black-white economy and say, yeah, whatever. It's all about us. No, it's not about us. It's about including us. But then I also had a responsibility to include Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Arab Americans now, which I'm working on now, is that when we're talking about the complexities of race, which is a social construct, you have to include people who are victims of that construct and what that means now. And there are no right or wrong answers, but there are legacies of discrimination.
Yeah, you had to do your homework, to say the least. Yeah. You're on mute. I'm sorry, but I got you.
Sorry about that.
No worries. How are we on time, by the way?
We're good. We're good.
We're good? Okay. I have a few more.
Okay.
But before I get onto them, because you did share some very important stories with me via email, I'd love for you to speak about them, because it's about your time working as a reporter during the pandemic. And so you talked about the Underground Railroad to Mexico. Would you like to speak about the other ones? And
Yeah, right. Yeah, right after that, I've been covering the pandemic. What I did, one of the last stories I was covering, also the misinformation that was going on social media. And the last story I did for the Associated Press was on a group called ADOS. There were a hashtag on social media called the American Descendants of Slavery. And many folks had said, well, this is a good hashtag talking about Black Americans descended from slavery and not Black immigrants. So they're trying to differentiate and say, what is owed to this? Great conversations. However, there had been studies that said, look, people running this hashtag are connected to misinformation. And they have connections to possibly groups that are anti-immigrant, that may be artificial, and we're posing questions. So I wrote this story, and I became attacked on social media for this, for not reaching out to the right people. When I did, they blasted me, posted my questions online, doxed me. Some people were calling me, putting my address online. So it became a big backlash. So at the Associated Press, they did not like any of the social media backlash. And so I got I reprimanded for this. And I wasn't the only one. There were a lot of journalists of color who were getting reprimanded for social media posting. This was happening a lot. Wesley Laurie from the Washington Post was also doing this. In fact, a lot of journalists of colors had the same experiences where they were posting social media. Some were saying their opinions about Black Lives Matter movement, are openly saying things about their newsroom, and we're getting pushback, because that's not what reporters are supposed to do. And what we were saying is like, no, that's not what white reporters are supposed to do. What are our obligations as journalists of color to speak on this matter? Some of it defines us by birth. We have to speak that. We're not asking to take a stand, but what saying Black Lives Matter is not necessarily a political stance. It's saying don't kill Black people for no reason. And so in my particular case, the organizers of this were able to get the Associated Press to say, look, he's taking sides, even though I'd done my reporting. And so I saw the writing on the wall and said, okay, this legacy media company does not get it. So by that time, my conversations with Axios were heating up. And I said, it's time to go. I've done all I can here. And Axios knows everything. They have no problem with it. They have their own policies. They say, we want you to be a personality, do what you can do, don't embarrass us, do good stories. Are you willing to do so? And I said, yes. I noticed a change right away. And this happened, unfortunately, right before the election when I made the transition. So this was the only election I was able to cover for the first time since I was in this business in 2020. So it was one of the most important elections. And I was right in between the transition. And so when I started at Axios right afterwards, I noticed the change right away that I was so inundated with the Associated Press that this was the pinnacle of journalism, been around for hundreds of years. What I noticed, I started looking at the data as we were writing stories and they were going to newspaper sites all over the country. And yes, they were going to hundreds, but who was reading them? They were going to these newspaper sites and being buried on the websites. You had to click, click, click to get them. The reach was being small. I go to Axios and immediately my first story, tons of emails, tons of feedback, tons of interaction. I'm there. And I noticed that this right here, this cell phone, is where the news consumption was happening. And it was happening through the Associated Press and going through the back channels, but it was like the fourth thing, where Axios was number one. And we're writing in a smart brevity format that lends itself to the way people were consuming news and people were getting that. And so I knew right away, I saw the change. I saw my profile go up. And by that March, Axios approached and says, how about, part of our business model is putting things on smart brevity and then putting them in a newsletter format that we can email folks. Would you be interested in starting a new product called Axios Latino, which is a product with Telemundo? We have this idea. Could it work? And I said, yes. And I started in December. By March, we were launching this new project and I was one of the co-authors and it took off. It was like night and day, a very supportive environment. The whole ideas of legacy and its racism did not exist. There were other problems that arise, of course, with any startup, but nothing like, there were no excuses like, oh, we can't because we have union rules and the seniority tend to be the white reporters that were hired many years before we had initiatives to get people of color. So there were none of that. It was a clean slate. They asked me to help recruit people who, when there were openings, I had a whole list. And I then recruited, when we had an opening for an editor, I recruited one of my former students who I'd mentored, who was at Arizona State the journalism program. And I mentored her many years ago when I was at the Boston Globe. She came to the Associated Press. She actually replaced me at the Associated Press, my job on the race team, for a higher salary. And then I said, why don't you come here and be my editor? And she became my editor. Astrid Galvan is now my editor and has been here ever since. And I started going and finding other Latino reporters and other journalists of color to say, hey, this is a place we need to go. And I recruited my good friend, Delano Massey, who is now the managing editor for Local. He was African-American, one of our editors at the AP on the race team. And so the diversity at Axios changed. We're now the only media outlet, I think, that has its top two positions in the newsroom are women of color. So it is a place that has made some promises and has stepped up to them. And now I can tell you we're nowhere near where we need to be, but I'll take the Pepsi challenge with any media outlet now today, because we don't have that legacy that others do.
Wow. I mean, I'm sold. I'm going to start looking. Yeah, no, that's awesome. I mean, because even I was really moved by the writing style. It's very considerate of the reader. You tell them what matters, where to place their further thinking, looking at the bigger picture and all that. And do you think those attributes are part of the success?
Yeah, because look, I'm in long form journalism. I got my graduate degree in creative writing. I love good writing, but sometimes when you have to tell a story about, say, something that happened, a pandemic or a vote on the House, you don't need to give a flowery lead and put the news in the fifth paragraph. And now that I've been in this environment for a long time, and I get almost offended when I click a story like George Santos is going to be expelled because of new evidence. And so I click the story, and then you give me a rundown of the past news the last 5 weeks before you get to the news. I get offended. No, tell me what's the news. I'll get all that if I need to. We also tell you how long you're going to spend on the story. Give me a minute of your time. Give me 2 minutes of your time, and you'll you'll leave to get smarter. And I think a lot of times what is happening in our field is that the journalists were writing for other journalists, not necessarily the reader. And now that is catching up. And if you look at the data on stories, and if you have access to it, you can see how long people stay on stories. I mean, think just a few seconds before. And what's happening with media outlets, especially legacy news outlets that are newspapers, is the mobile device is their fourth thing. They go to the print, they go to the web, they may go to radio or something, and then the mobile device. But it's hard to read. You read the first few paragraphs, and then you have an ad that actually breaks the sentence off, then a pop-up, and then you move out. You're like, this is not worth it. That happens a lot, especially with broadcast sites when you're trying to get a text version of what the story is. Or they'll put a video and they put a commercial immediately, and then you like X'd out. You're only going to stay on that commercial and listen to it to get to the video if you want. If you're trying to get information for your fantasy football team, if you get information about why that car crashed or overturned, you'll probably say, oh, I don't really need to know. I got time. I'm going to deal with that. So Axios has figured out the model of get in, get out, give it to in a email format, give it short, and that's where the growth is, because people want that accessibility.
Yeah, people love bullet points nowadays. I think that's a huge factor. Yeah. Were you gonna say something?
No.
Okay. I was gonna ask, what was the story that impacted you on how you viewed the pandemic? A story you covered.
The one thing that, I mean, I think the Kenosha was one because it was an intersectionality of the health orders and what was going on with Black Lives Matter. It was just a collision that one could not escape. And I think I was left knowing that something was going on in the country. And at that point, I was already talking to Axios, kind of skeptical, because I did my last long form piece because I spent time and I'm like, oh, I really like doing this. I don't know how many people read it looking back. I read it. I know my family read it and my friends read it, but did anybody else read it? Did it have any impact? I don't know. I'll never know. And that was one that affected. And then the leading up to my departure of the AP, seeing the reaction or the lack of reaction to support I was getting, that I knew and that it was a pandemic, and I knew that things were going to change. And going back into the newsroom, I didn't know I was a changed person. I was not going to go back in that newsroom the same person as I left. And I was not going to put up with some of these same excuses about diversity and the stories we're going to cover anymore. And that was only going to be a more clash. And I was a different person. And I just did not, I was losing my patience with the lack of action. And I knew that things would have to change.
Yeah. And on diversity, as a Latino person, that's important to you. And how would you define Latinidad? Like, we call, people are stumped on defining what it is, ethnicity, race, so on. Like, how do you define it?
I think it's a combination of everything. And I'm not to avoid the question, but for me, as a Mexican American, a fourth generation, I think we're still discovering it. We're still trying to define it. It's not just mestizaje. It's also our African past. It's also our indigenous and Arabic past. We need to come to terms with that. I think one of the things I did with the Underground Railroad to Mexico is, as I started looking and doing research, I found that there was one town called Monclova, Mexico, which was a stop on the Underground Railroad through documents. And I wasn't able to put in a story because it was just so much. And I started seeing that scholars were working on pieces. So I was interested and wanted to know, okay, well, what did my family do this time? I had this romantic notion that they had helped enslaved Black people leave to Mexico, because I know that they were family around the time of before the Civil War in Texas. And what struck me is I went down looking at my great grandfather, who was born in San Luis Potosí. I found a photo of his mother, who was a Black woman. It kind of confused me. It's like, well, everybody assumed she was indigenous, but as I zoomed in, I was like, these are features that you would say are close to the line to someone who's Black. And then I looked and I saw her birth, and looked online, and some documents say her birth town is in Monclova, Mexico. So was she the daughter of enslaved people escaping. So we did find some documents that say she was the daughter of people in hiding. There were other documents that say she was also born in San Luis Potosi. And as I started looking more, I was like, what's going on here? There were evidences that this Mexicano was tall. He was 6'2". You and I know there aren't that Mexicans that are tall. We're all short. We're 5'6" to 5'8". This brother was 6'2". I don't know how that happens. And they were also, he married a woman who's very indigenous. I was talking to you earlier from Laredo, and he was a blacksmith in Houston. And as I was talking to some of the elders on my mom's side who knew him, and a cousin who knew him too as well, said he would get very upset because as a blacksmith and when he was doing his work, and white customers would come in, they would use the N word at him. And I said, what did you ever ask why that was the case? And they said no, they thought because he was a dark-skinned guy. And then I found at one of the census, I don't know if it was the 2010 or 2000, I don't know, excuse me, 1910 or 1920 census, that under race or ethnicity, I don't know how it is, remember, but he listed himself as, or whoever it was that categorized him, listed it as mulatto. So this broke up some things to me that I was concerned about, and I think we don't discuss with Latinidad outside of the East Coast, is how influential is our Black past, especially for those Mexican Americans in Texas. You see it on, and now that when I go to Brownsville, I see it in Laredo, I see it in San Antonio, and I don't think we've had that discussion yet. It's not as evident as it is if you're saying Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean, but it's evident there. It's the way we talk. It's a language. There's a reason why there's hot tamales in Mississippi, and they call them a Southern, and we don't discuss how it got there, and nobody has a good explanation. There are reasons why there are blues influences in Tejano music, or in rock with Latino. There's these discussions that we never talk about, and I think for Latino Lad, when we're talking about it, these are things we have yet to explore. There have been people who've written about it. There have been books that touch on it, but in our literature and our novels from the Chicano movement, we very seldom jump into this. We've had some recent novels in our literature where we're engaging this, but if you look at early Chicano history, it's like black brown. We're repeating the same black white dichotomy, the problematics of that, by creating a white brown dichotomy, and not really, and that's not a full picture. I think for the rest of my life, as long as I'll be a journalist, that's something I'll be tackling from here on out. And I sort of said, well, if this affects me, who else does this affect? Now, I'm not going to interview everybody's stories and get them and be their therapist, but I am going to point out stories that point to this mystery and these changes that we have yet to tackle, but we will have no choice but to do so in the future.
Yeah, and that's huge because I'm relating to it too, because I also have a maternal great-grandmother who was very much not white, and we always speculated, oh, maybe she had a black parent or a black grandparent.
Right.
But it just ended at speculation, just because, oh, it's just she has curly hair, and it was just from one person. Yeah.
How did it happen? I mean, I think because it was the people that were fleeing were so scared, and they had to disappear, and they really didn't know their names because they had the names of the enslaver. They were able to adopt new names and new identities in Mexico, and so they became persons. So what they were or who they'd been had always been a mystery, so they invented themselves. But they also wanted to protect their family from the discrimination they would face. And maybe it was self-hatred, maybe it was self-preservation. The deal is we'll never know.
Yeah.
But it's up to us to try to pose those questions and see what we can find out.
Yeah. A small question with that. Where do you even begin to look for records that old?
Well, you go to ancestry.com, you could do DNA tests. There are some great works that are being done by a lot of scholars. You're going to start seeing this in the next few months and years of people dissecting what this means, this underground railroad to Mexico, that once we know exists, how did it operate? Was it organized? Where did they go to? That when white, what they call mobs, slave mobs, would go into try to Mexico to try to reclaim their quote property, how did the people of Mexico respond? What we do know is that some of those folks who fled got new names, became part of the community, learned Spanish, became postmasters. They fled deeper to the interior to get lost. And they didn't either know how to read or write, and they changed their names and didn't want to be found. So that's the challenge. We don't know where they went because they didn't want to be found at that time. But now we can find them through old histories, through things that we can piece together. And what we're finding, one guy I interviewed for the story said he found out he was connected to this biracial family right on the border who was a stop on the Underground Railroad, that his mother was Black, or his great grandmother was Black. That when they get together with family and they talk about it, there's resistance from some folks saying, how dare you say I'm Black, right? And he's like, no, I think this is fair. This is something we should talk about. And in fact, there are many people who have the same last name. I think the last name was Jackson. And they're like, no, our guy he's a white guy from Alabama. He was white. Well, who was he married to? Well, that's neither here nor there. So these are questions that we've always had to ask ourselves. It used to be just trying to admit that we had indigenous past. We like to say that it's just a Spanish past, especially here in New Mexico. I can tell you right away, everybody is and a lot of people here are invested into this Spanish purity, which is also based on white supremacy and racism, and based on an idea of trying to get New Mexico a state in 1912 by saying it's not a place of mixed mongrel people, as was the critics would say, but a place of Spanish purity, that has transcended over generations, and we're still dealing with the legacy of that. And I think being my position as someone in Houston who has this mixed heritage, who knows about it, you can see this complexity. And it goes back to our original question about how we cover race. That's the story. It's more complex, to me, more interesting than the black-white dichotomy that we need to talk. Those are the stories that are there. Those were invest. And then when you get into that, what I found in this journey is I stumbled upon the legacy of the Black Cowboy. And that became my latest generation. Because if you see the Black Cowboy, one of the original vaqueros, there was an interaction between Black and Latinos that still we have not uncovered. That while we are obsessed right now with the television show Yellowstone, it has void of any Latinos in Montana, that we're overlooking the original Cowboys, which is really a Black-brown creation in the United States.
Yeah. Have you uncovered anything in that discovery yourself?
What I found is I stumbled upon this really cool community of Black cowboys who do Black rodeos across the country. And rodeos are real popular, but Black rodeos get a fraction of the winnings that white rodeos do. But they are just as intense. And there are a number of people on social media, especially Instagram, who take photos of Black cowboys. And they're not necessarily people in Wranglers and cowboy hats, although you do have that. You have people in hoodies, in urban gear, on horses. I was in Houston and I always saw Black people on horses. I thought that was just what people did in an area that was kind of semi-rural. But this happens in Oklahoma. I did a story on a brother in Portland, Oregon, who did a Black rodeo on Juneteenth. And people kind of dismissed it. What kind of Black people will go to the Northeast for rodeo? And it actually sold out. And it was one of the most popular events that the organizers there, or the people who run the facility, said, let's bring this again. So there is a hunger there. And I think we've yet to tap in what's going on in this area. It's about Black perseverance. These are the people, are the original folks who've kept the first generation of emancipated people alive because they were in rural areas. They're keeping a lot of their cultural ways there. And it manifests itself in a rodeo. To me, that's fascinating, because you're looking at Black people, the absence of whites, how they survive and what they created. I just can't get enough of that.
And validly so. I mean, it's such an important story to tell. And it's amazing that you are covering that sort of thing and giving it the time and effort. With that, and I'm sorry to jump topics again, but you mentioned that folks in New Mexico cared a lot about Spanish heritage, and you shared a story that kind of reflected that. And I don't know if I had my dates right, but it seemed like it was during the pandemic. And so I was thinking to myself, like, this is what y'all are worried about during the pandemic. So could you
Well,
tell me about?
this is a good point, because if you remember during the racial justice marches, they started taking down statues of people connected to enslavement and Confederate statues. Well, here in New Mexico, they started taking down statues related to conquest. So Native Americans were saying, okay, they in Virginia are taking down Robert E. Lee. We in New Mexico want to take down the Yonate statue, or that statue of the conquistador. That needs to go down. If you're going to be if you're going to be just in what you're saying, we need to get rid of these symbols of racial hatred, then you need to also confront your own. And in New Mexico, it is the celebration of the conquistador and what he represents, because it's mainly women, it's mainly men, that you have privileged these statues that have always been full of tensions between Hispanics and Native Americans. But it's the way Hispanics in New Mexico celebrate their heritage. They're very interested in their history, but they're interested in pre-colonial, not civil rights. So, for example, we don't have any statues in New Mexico of George I. Sanchez, the civil rights leader who played a key role in desegregation, corresponded with Thurgood Marshall before Brown versus Board of Ed, who they have a school named after him at the University of Texas. He's from Albuquerque. There's nothing. And I remember way before the pandemic doing stories about him, that this product of New Mexico, where we privilege our Hispanic heritage because we have the numbers, that you do not celebrate. And so after I did this story, it confronted the school board, and they actually named a school after him. So I felt very connected to that it was the activists who saw we need to do something. So when you flash forward to the racial justice protest, these symbols of tensions, this conquistador, started coming down. And so I wrote a few stories, and one of my sources who I talked to years, who was in LULAC and all these events, he got really angry at me when I started writing stories saying, I don't get it. I'm from Texas. You're an idiot. And he did not want to engage in those spaces. He wanted me to stop. And finally, he ended up writing a letter on behalf of LULAC, which was a violation of their policies, where he said, anybody who's teaching that conquistador is bad at the University of New Mexico, those classes should be banned. Basically, essentially calling for the banning of ethnic studies. And so I called LULAC and said, no, that's not our position. And he later got removed, and it became very intensified. He wanted to pursue legal action. At that time, the Associated Press says, we see nothing wrong with it. These stories are, accurate. And there was a group of folks in New Mexico who still to this day are angry that I did those stories. That for some reason they wanted me to side with them and saying you're attacking, our heritage. And me just calling balls and strikes and saying, no, these Native Americans are saying the same thing these Black activists are saying. This is offensive to us. We're not saying you shouldn't, talk about this, but we shouldn't use public money to celebrate them, because these folks were responsible for the pain of my ancestors. Where do you draw the line? And I always said, well, okay, if you're going to take these statues down, there's this dichotomy of should they go up, go down? What should go and replace it? And I remember talking to Robert W. Lee, the great-great-grandnephew of Robert E. Lee. He was saying, you take down these statues, you should just leave them empty. These empty spaces remind us of what was once there. I think they're beautiful. Leave the graffiti up. Others would say, why don't we replace them with modern-day heroes or modern-day figures like George I. Sanchez, right? Or some of our women leaders that we've let, like Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta is from New Mexico. She was born in Dawson, way north of me, near the Colorado border. And there's no marker there citing where she was born, or anything that says here is where one of our greatest civil rights leaders began. There's nothing. So if you're going to take down a statue of Conquistador, you're complaining, but you're not even doing the effort to remember Dolores Huerta. I think that's telling about you and about what you feel is important. Now, they did name a street, part of a street where there's Cesar Chavez. It then becomes Dolores Huerta at a key point, right at the middle of the Rio Camino Real, the road that used to go from Santa Fe to Mexico City. So that's important, and that's, I think, symbolic. But we still haven't done the effort to remember those. And by the way, she's still alive at this moment, at the time of this recording, that she has. And I've even asked her, and in our interview, I asked her, should you, and she blows it off and says, we should remember people in that mining town who died. So she's always not making it about her. And yeah, you can if you want, but I think you should remember the other people who live in that mining town who suffered. That's what I want to remember.
Wow, no, that's powerful. And that's an interesting tale because it's so American, even on universities,
Right.
like the ones here on campus, the statues of people of color are all student raised, fundraised, and
Right.
the statues of white people were university funded.
Sure.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Another question I have for you, because I know I'm pushing it with your time. Did your work covering the pandemic as a Latino affect your understanding of health disparity as it relates to the Latino community?
Yes, but I would say it also helped me understand its disparity with Native Americans
Hmm.
more so. I mean, with Latinos, yes, we didn't have access to a lot of things. We were the essential workers. We were working whenever I would go to the stores that were still unpacking things. So they were still in the field because of our survival for the rest of us. But where I saw it really hit were Native American communities that really didn't have access. But what I did see among Native Americans is had such, and I had no data on this, but I could only see tangential, and I would see what was going on. They had such a long relationship with the federal government that when vaccines came, they were really good at getting the vaccines out to the elders and the people. So much so, and I wrote about this, is that some of the tribes started getting vaccines to non-tribal members. Hey, we're good. We have vaccines galore. We're taking care of all our people. Who wants to come? So various pueblos started getting vaccinations to Latinos, kind of like giving back. And some of the same people who wanted to celebrate conquistadors were coming in saying, yes, I want the vaccine. They were very organized. But it had a terrible effect because the Navajo Nation is still, in some parts, we're living as if there was the 19th century. No running water, no electricity. So when everybody was sending out all these proclamations, wash your hands, it's not possible in the Navajo Nation, and it's not possible in the Lakota Nation where you don't have running water, where you have to go a quarter of a mile to the well to get new water. It's just not. It didn't make sense. So it was spreading faster in those areas. So it got me thinking about poverty and thinking, how much have we changed since Robert Kennedy did his poverty tours? If we were to go to the same spots that he visited in parts of Mississippi, Lakota Nation, Appalachia, Central California, how much of things have really changed? And I would say we're no longer fighting hunger, we're fighting malnutrition. We're all eating fast foods. So we're not with the stomachs, but we're fighting obesity. We're still facing problems of access to, say, some basic electronics, and we have no access to broadband. So what exposed to me in some of the Latino communities, especially the rural areas, is they didn't have access to broadband. So they could not access telehealth, and their students could not access internet for classes. So you started seeing when I would drive around, families going outside of McDonald's parking to get Wi-Fi so their kids could go to class. It was a sad scene. I saw it a few times. Not one nation, you saw it all the time. People would tell me that, yeah, it happened. They would go to Wendy's or the McDonald's or the library, that they couldn't go in because it's still closed, but they kept the Wi-Fi on. They would go in and access it, and that's how they would do their classes. To me, that's just a gross exposure of inequality that I think, like, it angers me, and it just motivates me to do that Robert Kennedy book eventually, trying to follow the areas he visited and where we are today.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's so compelling. I mean, it needs the effort and time because, I mean, they're not going to get any better if we're not helping them.
Right,
Um, we
right,
as in, like, society, the government.
right.
Um, and Russell, is there anything else you'd like to share for this interview? Um,
No, I would say that the thing that came out is we've lost a lot of people, but what came out of it was that in media, at least, we did not want to go back to the way things were. We had people that came out, and people say that we were woke, but I never really was expecting the backlash, and it is. I think what will define us is what how things can dismiss as political just ideology, and some things that are just that we could frame as no, this is the right thing to do, and it's not about politics. It's about where we're going to be as a nation. I don't think we'll ever return to the days of apartheid media. It just can't happen because consumers will recognize it, reporters will speak out about it, and you won't survive. So for many years, we in media, especially Latino reporters, would say that you had a moral obligation to have a diverse newsroom. I think we're past that. Now we can say it makes a good business sense. You will not survive financially unless you have a diverse newsroom, right? It just doesn't make the way the country is changing demographically, the way we're consuming news. You can, if you want to target a particular audience, and that's your thing, but it's going to be limited. If you're going to survive in the new ecosystem, you have to have people that are reflecting the communities that look like you, and you have to have difficult conversations. If you don't, you won't survive.
Thank you for sharing that. And sorry to think up another question, but what solutions do you have for a lot of these issues that we covered that came up from the pandemic? Misinformation, distrust of media, journalists being mistreated and newsrooms mistreating them. Like,
I think you have to have journalists of color in the newsroom. You have to have I would say, I would add to that, LGBTQ plus journalists. You have to have journalists who have disabilities in the newsroom, that they are in there engaging in conversations and in leadership positions, so that those who are committed to the ethics of your newsroom and who are committed, that they will foster that mission and see things you want, and they'll challenge misinformation and report it and do the facts. We're not advocates, so we're not going to go and march in the streets, but we'll do our jobs in gathering and telling stories and showing the truth. The truth is subjective, yes, and it's not about objectivity, but it's about being accurate. If you're accurate and honest, those people will survive the torrential hate on social media going on. That especially with the coming of AI, that a lot of newsrooms are not having conversations about, especially the small newspapers, because they're in survival mode. The ones that are on the cusp we are definitely. What does this mean to us? Is this taking our content and repackaging it? Is it should we be worried about AI generated reports? All that should be happening now, because I don't think we even know what the end of the tunnel will look like. We're just seeing that there's a light there, and we're just barely entered it. So those are things that we have to look out. But it will not do us any good if we don't have the right staff, the right personnel, and the right missions to enter that tunnel. If we do that, we're just going to be circling in the dark, bumping into each other, crashing into walls, and getting scraped knees and breaking bones before we can crawl to what's deep down there, which is a long ways off.
No, I mean, I agree, especially the AI part.
Right.
Plagiarism has been a bit talking point for a lot of media personalities.
Right.
Yeah. But for sake of your time, anything else you want to add for recording's sake for the Oral History Center?
No, I think that's great. I think really like the oral project. The center interviewed my great uncle, who was a World War II vet when it first started, a Holocaust liberator. So it's an honor to be part of this effort and to continue not only your work, but his work and remembering us as a people.
Yes, and I want to say, Russell, you're still young, so I'm gonna have Dr. Maggie bother you again in a decade or so, 2 decades,
Sure.
because you have a lot to share. That's
Sure.
very important.